Thanks, Tom. I just want to briefly orient you to a panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. First thing I want to say is that this is the final event in a series that has been planned, that began in New York and then continued over the weekend in London. And as I say, this is our third and final panel. All of them addressing the same panel description, the same questions. And speakers have included Lauren Goldner, Paul Maddock, David Harvey, and Andrew Kleinman in New York, Saul Newman, James Boydhausen, Hillel Tipton, and David Graeber in London. And here today we have with us Raymond Lotta, Joe Persky, David Ruccio, and David Scheickart. And I'm very glad that they were able to attend. I'll introduce them individually in just a second. I want to first read the panel description and then the questions that we've submitted to the panelists for them to address. The panel description reads as follows. The present moment is arguably one of unprecedented confusion on the left. The emergence of many new theoretical perspectives on Marxism, anarchism, and the left generally seem rather than signs of a newfound vitality, the intellectual reflux of its final disintegration in history. As for the politics that still bothers to describe itself as leftist today, it seems no great merit that it has largely disconnected from the academic list disputations over everything from imperialism to ecology. Perhaps nowhere are these symptoms more pronounced than around the subject of the economy. Radical political economy has witnessed a flurry of recent works, many quite involved in their depth and complexity. Similarly, recent activism around austerity, joblessness, and non-transparency, while quite creative in some respects, seems hesitant to oppose the status quo mantra, there is no alternative, with anything but nostalgia for the past, above all for the welfare state. And here we had in mind slogans like a New Deal. At a time when the United States has entered the most prolonged slump since the Great Depression, the European project founders on the shoals of debt and nationalism. If the once triumphant neoliberal project of free markets for free people seems utterly exhausted, the strange death of neoliberalism, as a recent book title has it, seems poised to carry on indefinitely. The need for a Marxist politics adequate to the crisis is as great as such a politics is lacking. In 2011, that year of revolution now seems to be fading into the past. In Greece today, as elsewhere in Europe, existing left parties remain largely passive in the face of the crisis, eschewing radical solutions, if they even imagine such solutions to exist. In the United States, Occupy has vanished from the parks and streets, leaving only bitter grumbling where once was seeming creativity and open-ended potential. In Britain, the 2011 London riots, rather than political protest, was trumpeted as a shattered generation's response to the crisis, overshadowing the police brutality that actually occasioned it. Finally, in the Arab world, we are told the 2011 revolution is still afoot, though it seems inconceivable that that revolution, even as it bears within it the hopes of millions, could alter the economic fate of any but a handful. While joblessness haunts billions worldwide, Politicization of the issue seems chiefly the prerogative of the right. Meanwhile, the poor worldwide face relentless price rises in fuel and essential foodstuffs. The prospects for world revolution are remote at best, even as bankers and fund managers seem to lament democracy's failure to confront the crisis. In this sense, it seems plausible to argue that there is no crisis at all, but simply the latest stage in an ongoing social regression. What does it mean to say that we face a crisis when there is no real prospect that anything particularly is likely to change, at least not for the better? So that was the panel description. And these are the questions that we asked, and they are longer than it is possible for anyone, no matter how talented, to address in 12 minutes. And it isn't intended that they should be able to address them all, but rather that these questions, in a sense, should give you a sense of the scope of the conversation that we intend to host over the course of the event, over the course of the entire evening, I should say. And the questions are as follows. Do we live in a crisis of capitalism today? And if so, of what sort? Political, economic, social? Is capitalism basically the same in its laws of motion? And can it be grasped equally well today as it was by Marx? What difference, if any, does the collapse of the socialist workers' movement make for our understanding of capitalism? 2. Why are sophisticated leftist understandings of the world seemingly unable to assist in the task of changing it? Conversely, is the world intelligible despite our incapacity to transform it politically? Can the left survive as an economics or social theory? Is our work more difficult today in theorizing capitalism, or is it simply of a completely different kind than it was for past generations of leftist intellectuals? 3. Many on the left welcomed the Occupy movement in 2011 because, above all, it responded to capitalist austerity in its slogans and characterized itself in class terms. Did Occupy become a renewed salience of class? How did Occupy and other movements worldwide differ from the political response, whether by the new social movements or others, to the crisis of Fordism beginning in the late 1960s and crystallizing with the oil crisis in 1973? How does the present crisis, 4, how does the present crisis compare with past crises of capital? What might we expect to be the duration of the present crisis? Is there an end in sight? Or are we witnessing a terminal crisis of capitalism? How would we know? If not the end of capitalism as such, does the present crisis at least signal an end to neoliberalism? If so, what will take its place? 5. How do your political views influence your understanding of capitalism and of this crisis? In what sense is economics as a science or a discipline independent and autonomous from those politics? How do you avoid the danger of your theory simply confirming your politics, rather than allowing our understanding of present circumstances to push beyond the present political impasse? And 6. At different moments of its unfolding, the crisis has been differently expressed in different locations. A subprime mortgage crisis in North America, then a sovereign debt crisis in Europe, and now in a still different form in China. What is the extent of the present crisis, and how has it been distributed globally? Unevenly? What does globalization look like in a period of prolonged crisis? Is the era of U.S. hegemony at an end? And if so, what will take its place? How is or was American imperialism connected to first Fordism and later post-Fordist capitalism? And how does the new capitalism challenge the new American empire-led global reorganization? these are our speakers, and they're going to speak in alphabetical order, which is also the order that I'll introduce them in. To my left here, Raymond Lotta is a political economist and writer for Revolution newspaper. He's an advocate for Vonnegutt's new synthesis of communism and promotes the perspectives of the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. He is the author of the 1984 book, America in Decline. He has continued to publish and lecture on developments in the world capitalist economy, their global social effects, and how all of this influences what he sees as the possibilities for revolutionary change. Lotta has done extensive work in regard to the socialist revolutions of the 20th century, including on issues of socialist planning and on what he describes as the restoration of capitalism in the formerly socialist Soviet Union and China. Not immediately to his left, but not far in the second from the end. Joe Persky's research has focused on distributional implications of regional economic growth. With Daniel Felsenstein and Virginia Carlson, he is co-author of Does Trickle-Down Work?, an essay which explores local development policy in an economy characterized by perennial unemployment. Persky is a founding member of the Chicago Political Economy Group and a co-author of the group's A Permanent Jobs Program for the U.S., Economic Restructuring to Meet Human Needs. Persky received his PhD from Harvard in 1971 and is taught at Fisk University, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Yale, and he's worked as a senior staff economist for the New York State Council of Economic Advisors. Persky recently held a Lady Davis Fellowship at the Institute of Urban and Regional Studies at Hebrew University. And all the way at the end is David Ruccio, who is professor of economics, but not a member of the economics department, as he points out to me, at the University of Notre Dame, and the past editor of the journal Rethinking Marxism. His most recent book is Development and Globalization, a Marxian class analysis. His current book project is titled What's the Matter with Exploitation? He writes about economics, culture, and society in the midst of the Second Great Depression on his blog, occasional links, and commentary. And that's at anticap.wordpress.com. And finally, just to raise left here, second from me, David Scheickart is professor of philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago. He holds PhDs in mathematics and philosophy, and is the author of 3 books and co-author of one, his latest being After Capitalism, second edition in 2011. He is also the author of numerous articles in social and political philosophy. His work has been translated into Chinese, Spanish, French, Slovak, Farsi, and Catalan. He has given, someday I'll have something published that's translated into Catalan. He has given presentations in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Cuba, El Salvador, Venezuela, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Sweden, Norway, the Philippines, and China. Okay, so without further ado, the way we're going to proceed tonight is going to be as follows. Each of our speakers is going to speak for 12 minutes, and I'm going to hold them to that. I know there's not much time. But then after that, I'm going to give them the opportunity to then respond to one another for 1 to 2 minutes. And then at that point, I will or will not myself ask a question as moderator, and then I'll turn it over for questions from the floor, hopefully for a good long time, and we'll take those in batches of 3. So to begin with, Ray Lotta.
I want to thank the Platypus Society for organizing this very important forum. Now, I have written extensively on the current crisis and the shifts and fault lines in the world imperialist economy that are shaping this crisis. We can explore this in the panel discussion and in the Q&A. What I want to focus on here is the underlying problem that confronts humanity and the fundamental way out, the revolutionary alternative. At the root of imperial wars, predator drones, and torture, at the root of the recent fire that killed 120 workers, mainly women, in the textile factory in Bangladesh, at the root of the fact that each and every day 25,000 children died of malnutrition and preventable disease, is that the capitalist imperialist system has a stranglehold on the resources on the planet, on scientific knowledge, and on human potential. It is a stranglehold of bourgeois property relations enforced by a violent state power controlled by and serving the capitalist ruling class. I'm talking about the key organs of government, the military, the courts, and the police that violently evicted the Occupy protesters from city centers around the country. I'm talking about the U.S.'s 700 military bases around the world. Now, much of the mainstream discourse about the current crisis and the workings of the capitalist system revolves around a suffocating dichotomy between a liberal social democratic capitalism, one that would ostensibly affect a more equitable distribution of wealth, and a privatizing, deregulating neoliberal capitalism. These are seen as the only choices. The New Deal of FDR is held up as a regulatory model for what could be. And even radical-minded forces, some in Occupy, often do not escape the bounds of this paradigm. Here I want to make 2 points. The New Deal, as well as the Great Society of the 1960s, rested on the plunder and exploitation of the great majority of the planet. Second, the prolongation of the system, or to put it differently, the fact that there was no revolution in the 1930s and 1960s has meant the prolongation and intensification of the suffering of world humanity. The millions that died as a result of the U.S. wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, the continued subjugation of women, objectified, shrouded, degraded, the mass incarceration of black and Latino youth, and not least, the onset of the global environmental emergency that is literally threatening the ecosystems of this planet. No amount of reform or regulation is going to alter the fundamentally oppressive and exploitative nature of the system. You see, the system of capitalist imperialism has its own logic and dynamics. It operates according to certain economic rules, compulsions, constraints. Rule number 1, everything under capitalism is produced as a commodity for sale, and profit is in command. Housing, telecommunications, medicine, food. What's produced and how it's produced answers to the dictates of profit. Rule number 2 is the imperative expand or die. Toyota and GM and Exxon and BP are competing for market share. If they don't expand, if they don't cheapen costs, if they don't exploit ever more ruthlessly, they face the prospect of getting outcompeted, swallowed up, or going under. Rule number 3 is the imperialist drive for global dominance. On the global playing field, corporations and banks compete for influence and control, like the oil corporations scrambling to drill in West Africa. But the most intense form of rivalry is between contending world powers for strategic power and advantage, for strategic position over regions, markets, and resources. There's the U.S. and the Middle East, the West European powers moving on Libya. Twice in the 20th century, great power rivalry led to 2 world wars. These rules of the game, these dynamics of capitalism, set the limits and boundaries to any regulations and enacted changes enacted in capitalist society. Take carbon emissions. There's been no fundamental or decisive move away from profitable fossil fuels. And here we are. The world is closer than ever before to catastrophic and irreversible climate change. We need revolution to break the stranglehold I'm talking about. Revolution to emancipate humanity and to protect the planet. And let me be clear. Revolution means that a revolutionary people led by a far-sighted vanguard leadership meets and defeats the repressive power of the capitalist ruling class in a revolutionary situation. It means dismantling the oppressive institutions of state authority of this society, the police and courts, the prisons and bureaucracy. Socialist revolution establishes a new state power, the dictatorship of the proletariat, with new governing institutions serving the emancipation of world humanity. It established a new economy that operates on the basis of social needs, social planning, and social cooperation. Socialism is a society in motion where people are changing society and changing themselves towards a world without classes and antagonistic social conflict, a world community of humanity, that is communism. The fact is, the first wave of communist-led revolutions, beginning in the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1956 in China, from 1949 to 1976, opened a new chapter in human history. These were the first attempts to build societies free from exploitation and oppression, and they achieved amazing things against incredible obstacles. But these revolutions also had serious problems and shortcomings. Bob Avakian, chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, has dug into and evaluated this momentous experience. He summed up the lessons, positive and negative, of these revolutions. He has drawn from broad spheres of human experience and intellectual and scientific endeavor, and he has brought forward a new synthesis of communism. The Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America, and this comes from the Revolutionary Communist Party, is based on this new synthesis. This Constitution is an inspiring vision of and a concrete framework for a whole other way of organizing society that would benefit the vast majority of humanity. Let me give some examples. The new socialist state power would make common cause with, not wars against, the oppressed of the world. One of the first acts of the new socialist republic will be dismantle all overseas military bases of the former United States. A new socialist economy would be guided by three overarching purposes: promoting the world revolution, meeting social needs, contributing to people's all-round development, and overcoming the oppressive division between those who principally work in the realm of ideas and those who principally engage in physical labor. The divisions between different nationalities, regions, and the oppressive divisions of sex and gender. And three, this economy would be protecting, not plundering, the resources and ecosystems of the planet. How will this socialist economy be regulated? It would be a socialist planned economy that combines centralization with decentralization. You need centralization to provide overall leadership and coordination, to focus on key priorities and to allocate resources based on the great needs of society and the world. For instance, in addressing racism, the environmental emergency, and patriarchy. But at the same time, there will be extensive decentralization, local decision-making, responsibility, and initiative within the framework of a unified socialist economy and society. This would be a state power that mobilizes people to uproot the legacies of the oppression of Black, Latino, and other minority nationalities. In terms of the environment, the new socialist economy and society will be putting the preservation of the ecosystems of the entire planet above its economic development. It will be working to heal the environmental damage caused by U.S. imperialism to other countries, promoting unprecedented planet-wide cooperation among scientists, sharing knowledge, and promoting understanding of the planet and appreciation of the planet, sharing expertise with the rest of the world while learning from others. The new society will be supported by a system of governance that empowers the great majority to take responsibility for the direction of society. This will be a society where dissent flourishes on a scale unimaginable in this society. People ask, will there be protests, demonstrations, and strikes in the new society? Yes, in fact, there will be Occupy-like takeovers and upheavals, and on an even grander scale. And welcome. Why? Because, as Bob Avakian emphasizes, dissent, including opposition to socialism, enables people to understand society more deeply, to get at the truth of things, including the shortcomings of socialist society, and to opening up pathways for change that can bring us closer to communism. No one, including revolutionary leadership, has a monopoly on truth. The kind of society that I am talking about is not a utopia. It is about the real possibilities bound up with the historical development of human society in technology, in knowledge, in people's determination and creativity. To actually meet, I'm talking about a society that can actually meet people's most basic needs and create a world in which human beings can truly flourish. I am part of building a movement for revolution around this alternative. Thank you very much.
12 minutes. So I hope you all took notes on the questions. My answers are yes, yes, don't know, yes, broadly, no, completely, broad, clearly. Okay. So maybe we'll get into more of those as we go forward. I think we're going to get lots of different opinions today, and arguments. My purpose here is probably to carve out what I hope is a theoretically defensible and politically meaningful ground between liberal Democrats on the right and those anticipating a final structural crisis in the near future, which I think is what we just heard about, right? The audience I see for this, I mean, these concerns about the left is dead, long live the left, I think there's an audience that we're talking to. It's not just people who happen to come in off the street. I think we're talking about a range of social activists, labor organizers, community workers, left academics, students, left liberals, radicals who already appreciate that a list of reforms, no matter how well crafted, will not be sufficient or possible until some more fundamental change is achieved. And B, that same group that suspects that as bad as things are, capitalism in the U.S. is not on its last legs, ready to topple. As a group, we need an ideological position that makes sense and defines middle-run goals. All right, having said that, sort of the basics from which I would think we could work, and I'm going to go through these again very quickly, and it's going to be a theme here to do things quickly, are the following 8 points, and I'm just going to list them and move on. So first, there's a long-run tendency for the profit rate to fall, if you haven't noticed. Second, that tendency has been repeatedly interrupted by counter-tendencies. Technological changes, mass migrations, incorporation of women into the labor market, expansion of capital into non-capitalist systems, geopolitical advantages of one sort or another. 3, in periods of favorable conjunction, I guess that was the post-World War II period we were talking about, and or international challenges, national capital is allied with labor, acquiescing in the improvement of living standards for a significant portion of the population. 4, capitalism over the last 30 years has successfully entered mainland Asia, creating massive opportunities for profit, but undercutting the profitability of much production in developed countries. That's the key. I don't think we're facing a crisis in the last few years that's fundamentally different from what's been building up over the last 30 years. The key fact has been this expansion into Asia. 5, one response has been the financialization of developed economies, which further squeeze profit margins of productive firms and further encourage the attack on labor in the United States. 6, in countries where national capital has long been partnered with labor, for example, Germany, Netherlands, other Northern European countries, it continues to explore, that is national capital, a range of mechanisms for coping with these world changes. Not clear how successfully. 7, but in the U.S., the neoliberal strategy of national capital points squarely towards falling real wages, expanding underemployment, and increasing unemployment. And that's what we've been seeing for the last 10 to 15 years. 8, there's a little quick, and I'm checking the time here, a little quick class breakdown, but I think people here are probably already familiar with that. But a bottom 30 to 40%, I'm just going to say it very crudely, a middle 40 to 50%, then a 15%, and then a top group that owns all the capital. We can come back and talk about how those groups could be mobilized and how they might relate to the things that I'm suggesting this evening. All right, So at least since the major recession of the early 1980s, the plan of national capital has been to destroy the modest protections offered by unionization, undermine the guarantees provided by the welfare state, and prevent the state from aggressively supporting aggregate demand and full employment. That's been the plan. The realism, and I have that in quotation marks of this plan, is defined by its broad consistency with the neoliberal drift of the world economy. It is not much of an exaggeration to suggest that this plan ultimately points toward a situation in which the three basic tiers that I just mentioned of the working class in the U.S. sink towards levels not dissimilar from those of corresponding groups in, say, South America. And again, that's something I think we could talk about. Recent efforts to rebuild a left consensus, left liberal consensus. I'm thinking here of a pamphlet that you might want to take a look at called Prosperity Economics, Building an Economy for All by Jacob Hacker and Nate Lowenthal. These efforts focus on a wide range of reforms with the explicit goal of saving the middle class. These proposals are meant sincerely, but the lessons of the last 30 years drive home the reality that the middling portions of the working class cannot maintain and improve their position in an economy characterized by massive unemployment and underemployment. Workers as a class cannot prosper unless the economy achieves meaningful full employment. And that's going to be the theme of my last few minutes here. The point is not to generate make-work jobs. Our economy cannot produce services and goods we so sorely need: childcare, education, healthcare, elder care, transport, utility infrastructure, a green energy economy. We can't do those things unless we actively redirect substantial shares of the nation's potential labor force and of the nation's capital into these high priority activities. In the present political reality, national capital led by finance capital is unmotivated to achieve full employment or to redirect production towards these real needs. Under the circumstances, the key fundamental and non-reversible social democratic reform is to rebuild the lower end of the labor market through a massive permanent job program paying living wages. Such a program is outlined in the Chicago Political Economy Group's Permanent Jobs Program for the U.S. You can take a look at it on our website, cpegonline.org. It includes constructing 4.8 or so million jobs per year, additional jobs per year, over the next 5 years. It emphasizes that this is going to be paid for by moving capital from the finance sector into the national economy with a 0.25% transfer tax on stocks, a 1.125% transfer tax on futures and derivatives, with a 0.01% tax on currency and currency derivatives, and a 0.02% tax on bonds and their derivatives. You put these together and we're talking about $1 trillion to be moved from the finance sector into the national economy. Such a jobs program would have to be complemented by major trade and industrial policy changes. And again, I refer you to our website for some suggestions along those lines. I'm going to conclude. And I know that I've been reading this to make sure that it all gets out, but I want to read the conclusion too, which is so good. While the political feasibility of this program is slight in the immediate run, articulating the goals of social democracy is in itself a politically meaningful act. It gives a focal point against which to evaluate all our other political activities. The exhaustion of the U.S. version of capitalism is most fully characterized by the long-standing and intensifying inability of the system to productively absorb the 30 to 40% of the country's workers who are super exploited when working, too often unemployed, not infrequently incarcerated, and in a constant struggle to maintain stable home lives. A restructuring of the labor market coupled with the achievement of full employment forms the very base of social democracy. I don't know if we can do this, but it's what we have to do to move forward. The focus of our political and organizing efforts must be to build a consciousness of what is possible, a consciousness of what attaining of financial capital can generate. Thanks.
Such a polite group. Everybody okay? Only two more to go. Here we go. Tom, thank you. Where's Tom? Where'd you run off to? Spencer, thank you. And the other members of the Platypus Society, it is my honor to be here. I'm not going to bore you with another radical interpretation of the crisis, at least in these opening remarks. Plus, there's just too much squabbling on the left in terms of coming up with the correct analysis of the crisis and giving it a name. Although I will permit myself to make one comment in response to Saturday's symposium, for which you sent us the link. I'm not convinced this is any kind of final crisis of capitalism, that we're in a situation that simply can't be solved on capitalist terms. I think that's a dream. As for me, I simply couldn't make sense of what is going on, the conditions and consequences of the current crisis, without Marxian theory, without either the ideas originally laid out by Marx or by the rich tradition of Marxist theorizing after Marx. And as it turns out, that's true of many others. From Nurio Rubini, aka Dr. Doom, to Mark Hake in the Harvard Business Review. What I've noticed is that Marx and Marxist concepts, such as capitalist crises, the idea of socialism, class, and so on, have been increasingly invoked by mainstream scholars and pundits in a wide variety of venues and publications. But let me add quickly three caveats. First, while references to Marx have increased in recent years, there's no indication that many of these commentators have actually read any Marx. Oh, perhaps the Communist Manifesto back in their school days, but certainly not Capital. And they certainly haven't read the scholarly work on Marx, which many of us have been trying to create and contribute to for many years. Perhaps they were afraid to, or didn't know how to, or were just, my favorite, plain too lazy. So they're not a good guide to what Marxism has to offer. Second, Marxists, or leftists more generally, can't claim much of the credit. In my view, most of the interest in Marx and other radical ideas today stems from the spectacular failure of mainstream economics in at least three senses. Mainstream economists failed to predict the crash of 2007 and 2008 and the resulting depression. Even more, they didn't even consider a crash even a remote possibility. The possibility of a crisis, starting with the housing and banking sectors, at least in the United States, didn't even exist in their theoretical frameworks. And once the crash happened, they certainly didn't know what to do. The policy that went along with their model suggested letting the banks sort out the problems. Until, of course, the panic that set in with the failure of Lehman Brothers. The whole world may come tumbling down, and they haven't done any better since. And third, I worry that in the rush to return to Marx, we're forgetting about all the important work that has been done over the course of the last 30 years to rethink and revitalize Marxist theory, and to resort instead to the more classical, more deterministic interpretations of Marxism. And that takes me immediately to the questions that were posed to us with our invitations to participate in the symposium and to join you here this evening, although I certainly won't pretend to answer even a small portion of them, not in the 10 to 12 minutes we've been allotted. There's no doubt that capitalism is in crisis in the midst of what I have come to call the Second Great Depression. It is an economic crisis, in the sense that while corporate profits in the United States have recovered and are now at an all-time high, a new set of conditions to maintain that profitability within and across countries has not yet been created. And it's certainly a social crisis, since corporate profits are the only things that have recovered. And the vast majority of the population in the United States and elsewhere have not experienced any kind of recovery. But it's not a political crisis, at least not yet, since the political contestation of capitalism has been at best sporadic, and aimed more at Wall Street and the imposition of austerity policies than at capitalism itself. And the political debate, as we saw in the most recent presidential campaign in the United States, continues to be dominated by the two mainstream parties. The one area not mentioned by the organizers, and this is not a criticism, is the intellectual. So let me add to their already large set of questions the following. Are we in an intellectual crisis? And I'd say we are. Conservative thinking certainly has nothing to offer, aside from an attack on government programs and the call to continue lowering taxes. And liberal thinking is not much better, since its only response to grotesque inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth is more education, even more American. What that means is there's lots of room for the left to respond to the plight of the majority of the population, which continues to suffer from growing poverty, long-term unemployment, and continued indebtedness. That's certainly true in the discipline of economics, where it's business as usual for the vast majority of mainstream economists. Think of the most recent Nobel Prize, which in the midst of the most severe economic crisis since the first Great Depression, was not awarded to economists trying to figure out what went wrong, but to a pair whose work is all about creating mechanisms where, as in the case of kidneys, markets don't exist. Actually. So what do we, as Marxists, have to offer? Not, it seems to me, an analysis of laws of motion, or the focus on regular cycles of long-term tendencies of this or that, or anything of the sort. Capitalism today is different from what it was in the mid-19th century, and each crisis in and of capitalism has its own specific conditions and consequences. But in my view, that makes Marxist work and Marxist theory generally more, not less relevant. Because what remains relevant is the Marxist critique of political economy. A critique of political economy is, of course, the subtitle of Capital. And that idea, critique, has taken on increasing significance in my own interpretation of what Marx was up to across the 3 volumes of Capital. It's an idea that Marx first announces in the famous 1843 letter to Ruccio. Quote, "If constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the result it arrives at, and the sense of being afraid, just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be." On that interpretation, Capital is a twofold critique. A critique of mainstream economics, the mainstream economic thought of his day, the classical political economy of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and the other classical political economists, decades before the mainstream economic thought of our day, neoclassical and Keynesian economics had emerged, and a critique of capitalism. So critique of economic theory and a critique of capitalism. The idea is that what Marx was doing, and what Marxists after him need to do, is less the application of a particular Marxian method, whatever it is called and however it is codified, and more the twofold critique of mainstream economic thought and of capitalism, the economic and social system celebrated by mainstream economists. Let me push that idea a bit further. The starting point of Capital consists in the taking for granted assumptions of both classical political economy and of bourgeois society, and then to develop a ruthless criticism. It begins by presuming, for the sake of argument, the rules of both mainstream economic thought and of capitalism, and then calling them into question. I could give many examples, but let me provide just 2 to illustrate my argument. First, the famous opening sentences of Volume 1 of Capital. Again, I quote, "The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity." What? Much to the surprise of many readers, certainly my students, Marx doesn't begin with history or class, but instead with the commodity. Bizarre. Why? My view is that's because the classical political economists then, just like neoclassical and Keynesian economists today, celebrated the great wealth, the immense accumulation of commodities, or in today's language, the gross domestic product produced by capitalism. That's Smith's wealth of nations. And in one sense, Marx agrees. capitalism does produce an enormous accumulation of commodities. So let's start with the commodity, and I'll show you, Marx eventually reveals, that once we get beyond border, and even before we get to capitalism, with the introduction of money, the universal equivalent, commodity exchange simply cannot guarantee smooth growth and full employment. Yes, money facilitates exchange, but it also destabilizes. So Say's law, the idea that supply creates its own demand, and therefore that full employment is guaranteed by free markets, can only hold in a system of barter exchange, not monetary exchange. Why is that significant? Think of all the arguments made today by mainstream economists. For example, that we just need the proper rules for monetary policy, or that we need a larger amount of fiscal stimulus. Both of those arguments follow the classicals in celebrating the immense accumulation of commodities, and both of them ignore the fact that an economy based on monetary exchange contains the possibility that at any point, commodity exchange can be interrupted, and depending on the circumstances, produce a generalized economic crisis, all on the basis of the assumptions of freedom, equality, property, and benefit presumed by the classicals. And consider now a second example. It's a common sense of bourgeois society that everybody gets what they deserve. Just desserts, as it is often put. That's as common sense a proposition as one will find during Marx's time and today in the society in which we live and work. We all get what we deserve, based on individual initiative and the decisions we make every day in the market. Not a chance. And at one level, Marx accepts the proposition, or at least uses it as his starting point. Let's assume that everyone does get what they deserve in commodity exchanges. Make all those heroic assumptions, and still Marx argues, after the exchanges are completed, and we enter the realm of production, capitalists get something they don't deserve. The extra value created by workers. The capitalists, in other words, get something for nothing. They engage in exploitation. And then they share that surplus value with still others. The shareholders in their enterprises, the CEOs who run their enterprises, the government that taxes an increasingly small share of those profits, even other capitalists with whom they compete in markets. They appropriate the surplus, but don't necessarily get to keep it. Marx's point. There's a fundamental injustice at the heart of capitalism, with all kinds of conditions and consequences for the rest of society, including crises and attempted solutions to those crises. That's the essence, to use a much maligned term in my own circles, of Marx's critique of both mainstream economics and of capitalism. He starts with their fundamental propositions and ends in a very different place. In other words, Marx takes these things, mainstream economic thought and capitalism, and makes them different from themselves. He denaturalizes them. He takes ideas and practices that are a kind of common sense. We're all better off with economic growth. We can access the necessities of life by selling our ability to work for a wage or salary and so on, and then shows how strange they are, on their own terms. In my view, that critique of political economy is our task. Today, just as much in the mid-19th century. Today, it involves a critique of contemporary mainstream economics, both neoclassical and Keynesian, both Greg Mankiw and Paul Krugman, if you will, and a critique of capitalism, with its new international division of labor, forms of financialization, austerity policies, the growth of state debt, and so on. And so to respond to another one of the questions informing the symposium, my political views are part and parcel of my economic analysis and my interpretation of Marx. But no more or no less than the views of other economists, with one key difference. They are committed in their different ways to making this economic system work, on the presumption that capitalism is only or the best way of organizing economic and social life, and therefore to imposing the kinds of economic policies to make that happen. That's why we, want to denaturalize capitalism, to suggest that Keynes' changes can and should be made in order to move in the direction of a different set of economic and social arrangements. Not just post-Fordist or beyond neoliberalism or with less austerity, but rather a situation where those who actually do the work in society participate democratically in appropriating and distributing the surplus they create. That, of course, is a small change. A change in one aspect of society and how enterprises are organized, with tremendous ramifications for the rest of society. Thank you.
Okay, last one up. Thank you all for hanging around. And thanks for inviting me here. I got a little set piece I'm going to read. It's not going to directly address the questions, although it's certainly going to address them indirectly. I've got 12 minutes, so I'm going to try to sort of sum up my life work in 12 minutes, okay? But I want to start with a quote. Here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to ensure an existence to its slave within slavery. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. That's a couple of young guys by the name of Marx and Engels back in 1848, in their little pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto. The title of my piece is A Ruling Class Unfit to Rule. Maybe a more recent quote. The need for another revolution should be obvious to all those who are not willfully blind. It is not, I fear, probable, but without doubt it is possible. This is Brian Barry, that some of you may know because he taught here at the University of Chicago in the political science department, some years ago. He was also, while here, the editor of Ethics, the preeminent journal in ethics in the English language. So not one of your usual suspects. He wrote this. That was the closing line of his beautiful book published in 2005, an angry book called Why Social Justice Matters. Now that conclusion was partly responding to what he talks about in the preface to that book. One thing can be stated with certainty. The continuation of the status quo is an ecological impossibility. The uncertainty lies in the consequences of this fact. It's quite in the cards that the response will be further retrenchment of plutocracy within countries and an ever more naked attempt by the United States, aided and abetted by a coalition of the willing, to displace the costs onto poor countries. Whether it succeeds or fails, the results will be catastrophic. But I shall argue that there's some grounds for hope which include growing discontent within rich countries with politics as usual. Barry wrote this before the economic crisis. He's thinking about the ecological crisis. We've now got two. Okay, two crises, real quick. An economic crisis in the heartland of capital, here and in Europe, caused ultimately, I would argue, by the new technologies that came into being 30 years ago or so, which gave rise to globalization, thus pitting worker against worker around the globe and keeping downward pressure on wages, and also the technologies that, unlike technologies of an earlier period, are destroying far more jobs than they're creating. And we should remember that rich country workers used to benefit from the unequal exchange with third world countries. Okay, we got the cheap resources and the bananas and all this kind of thing. That's no longer the case. We're in competition with those people now, and it's race to the bottom. It's also the case that the technologies of the 20th century, most of the 20th century, did create far more jobs than they destroyed. You think of the automobile, for example. Put the horse and buggy out of business, but all the cars and gas stations and highways and so on and so forth. Nothing like that is happening right now. Quite the contrary, the technologies are putting far more people out of work than are working, certainly in the heartland. And, important now, the capitalist class has no idea of how to solve this crisis. Hence the laughable solutions. Austerity in Europe, lay off more government workers, as if, then they're going to buy things and they're going to pay taxes and the budgets are going to come into balance. It's crazy, Or, closer to home, you can think of the proposal by one of our presidential candidates to cut taxes on the wealthy because they'll just spend all that money and put everybody to work. I mean, this is, I don't know. Can you say these things with a straight face? Okay, that's the economic crisis, which I argue the capitalist class as a whole does not know what to do about that in terms of solving it in anything that resembles the earlier period of high unemployment, rising standards of living, and so on. Environmental crisis, we know what needs to be done, but massive interests stand in the way, and moreover, a healthy capitalism requires growth. So we're in a tight corner. We get in a recession, everyone says we gotta grow, we gotta get growth going again, and yet the environmentalists are saying, but growth is killing the planet, okay? Because as Kevin Bowlby, an economist, once remarked, only a madman or an economist thinks you can have exponential growth forever in a finite world. So we got a crisis. We got a couple of crises. And here, just to kind of frame it a little bit, it's interesting to look back. Jürgen Habermas wrote a really interesting little book back in the early 1970s when he was still actually self-identified as a Marxist called Legitimation Crisis. And Habermas points out that the crises are different under advanced capitalism than they were in the 19th century. So you start with an economic crisis, like the one we're in, but in an advanced capitalist society, you expect the government to do something about it. You expect the political system to respond. When it can't, when it's gridlocked, you get what Habermas called a rationality crisis, okay? This, then, he argues, can lead to, if it's not resolved, a legitimation crisis. People start calling into question the very basic institutions of your society. And if this becomes strong enough, you get what he calls a motivation crisis, which, as he says, a systems crisis has to turn into an identity crisis on the part of lots of people. So, it seems to me right now, we're certainly on the verge of a legitimation crisis, okay? I mean, many people, probably most people, now feel there's something fundamentally wrong with this system. But how do we move from there to an identity crisis that would compel people to take action and change the system? Well, a lot of things, but one big thing, I think. The left must now confront the question, what is your alternative? Does there exist an economically viable set of institutions that would preserve the very real strengths of capitalism while mitigating its worst effects? This is the famous Tina question denying this. There is no alternative. This is what I've been thinking and working about for my entire academic life. Okay. So I argue we're in a position we can respond to that question in the affirmative. Yes, there does. There are a set of institutions, and let me just sketch them very, very quickly. They comprise what I call economic democracy. It consists of three basic institutions that correspond to the three basic kinds of markets that define capitalism. Capitalism, we say free market economy, but there's really three different kinds of markets. There's this markets for goods and services, the commodity markets. There's the labor market. There's the capital markets. Economic democracy keeps that first set of markets. Yes, we're going to have competition. It's going to be a market socialism. But it radically changes that labor market and financial market. Labor markets are changed by introducing democratic enterprises. Enterprises should be communities, not things to be bought and sold. When you join an enterprise, you get to vote, one person, one vote, for a worker council that appoints management and so on. Also, when you join an enterprise, you don't get a wage. This isn't wage labor anymore. You get a share of the profits. Not necessarily equal, but everybody's interest is tied to how well that company is doing. Lots of data out there. These democratic enterprises are efficient. They do work. Third big thing, democratic control of investment. Get rid of those private financial markets. Okay? Two parts. Well, where do you get your funds for investment then? Answer, don't rely on private investors like we do now. Then you're hostage to those people. It's easy. Tax for the investment funds. The correct tax, I've argued, is a capital assets tax, basically a flat rate business tax on all businesses out there. All of those funds are collected to the center. All of them go back into the economy for investment. How do they go back? Well, the procedure I recommend, at least prima facie, is per capita. Every region of the country, every community gets each and every year, as a matter of right, its per capita share of the National Investment Fund. It goes to these areas. Political decision is made as to what should be set aside for public investment and public processing. The other things go to public banks, for businesses in the market sector that want to expand, or new people who want to set up businesses, you go to these public banks for that. You get rid of all the private financial markets. So my argument has been, and most of what I've been writing, is that this stuff, would work. You'll have a viable economic order that would not have many of the defects of capitalism. For example, you don't have to worry about an economic crisis. You don't have any financial markets. You don't have any speculators, okay? In addition, you don't have that deep problem. When there's a productivity gain, there's no wages. Democratic enterprise have no interest whatsoever in keeping pressure down on wages. You get, a share of the profits, okay? Environmental crisis. Economic democracy does not have to keep growing to remain stable. Unlike a capitalist economy, a democratic economy can take its productivity gains in increasing leisure instead of consumption. Okay, we all know, millions of studies, more consumption doesn't make people happier. We can take it in terms of shorter work days, longer vacations, things like that. And we have control over investment. And if we're going to deal with these long-range problems, of which, environmental problems, climate change, by the way, I presume you all know this coming in, it's December and 70 degrees, right? You're going to have control over investment to deal with this. Okay, final remark. It's actually a poem that another person who died recently, Brian Barry died recently, is the novelist Kurt Vonnegut. In his last book, his last poem, entitled Requiem. The crucified planet Earth, should it find a voice and a sense of irony, might now well say of our abuse of it, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. The irony would be that we know what we are doing. When the last living thing has died on account of us, how poetical it would be if the earth would say, in a voice floating up perhaps from the floor of the Grand Canyon, it is done. People did not like it here. So the stakes are very, very high. One final quote, one that electrified me when I first read it 42 years ago as a first-year graduate student in philosophy. The philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Thank you.
Yeah, so these guys don't have to get up. They can just seated where they are. And I know that it's not entirely symmetrical, that when we do this, that the person who starts doesn't get to reply to the ones who conclude, but hopefully they'll be able to reply to anything they don't have a chance to reply to afterwards in the Q&A. And so I'll encourage them to take notes and fold in any question that's addressed to them that they don't have a chance to reply to in their remarks to the opening set of Q&A questions. So we're gonna have replies from the speakers. They can either amplify their remarks, they can ask for clarification from their colleagues and comrades, though again that only works in one direction. Or they can take issue with anything that's been said. And we're going to go in the same order that the speakers delivered their opening remarks. So, Ray.
1 to 2 minutes. Well, I'm going to use my time to take issue with some of the points that have been made here. I mean, first of all, I think there's in the case of David, I just want to go through some of the David Ruccio. First, there is no final crisis of capitalism. Capitalism, will either muddle its way through at the great cost to humanity and the environment. It will more savagely exploit and super exploit. And capitalism will not fall in and of itself. It must be consciously overthrown. Capitalism now has the capability to destroy the planet destroy humanity in terms of nuclear war or what it does to the ecosystems of the planet. But all of this argues for a real revolution. That is, we have to understand what the stakes are for humanity, the suffering, and what is required is to actually transform this system to make a total revolution. And what I've been talking about, this Constitution puts forth a vision and a framework for a viable and visionary alternative to capitalism that can only be achieved on the basis of making revolution. And I would encourage people to go to revcom.us and learn about the strategy for revolution that the Revolutionary Communist Party has brought forward. We are actually building a movement for revolution that can actualize this vision, this alternative, this framework. So that's point one. Point two, there's a problem in the speakers not addressing the question of empire. The fact is, the United States is the home base, the economy, the domestic economy of the U.S. is a home base of an international network of exploitation. And the idea of creating, some redistribution of wealth in this country or some more democratic mode of corporate governance or some reform without an understanding that everything about the structure and functioning of the U.S. economy is bound up with its international dominance in the world. And it's not true. Bananas, unequal exchange, well, I'm sorry. The super exploitation of labor in the bowels of the sweatshops in China are bound up with the financialization of the U.S. economy. There is a concrete relationship between the financialization of the U.S. economy and the globalization, the intensified globalization of production. We have to understand that the U.S. economy exists on this foundation, and this is a very important point, and the kind of revolution that we're talking about is a revolution that is actually going to reconfigure the structure and the functioning of this economy, a socialist economy that no longer feasts on the world. And this has not been addressed by the speakers. It's very disturbing to make the suggestion that somehow we can do these things, absent an understanding of how the U.S. is actually dominating the world economy and what it does to the people of the world. Third, okay. Okay.
Joe, you'll have to. Okay, please. Yeah. I just want to expand on one point, and I guess I don't know. I don't usually find myself on the right of a panel, but I have this feeling that somehow I am here this evening. But we spent $3 trillion plus getting out of this, getting through this mess that we've recently gone through on Wall Street. The kind of programmatics that I was talking about earlier, that would end up with $1 trillion per year, employing something like 20 to 25 million people in the economy. I don't want people to think that that's not a major structural change in our economy. If we can do something about the bottom third, bottom 40%, the entire labor market that you were mentioning, all of a sudden that changes. This is a realistic number to tax financial capital this amount. We can do that, and it will have major effects. Will it lead to worldwide communism? Probably not. But it will lead to a much more constructive United States in world affairs, and I absolutely agree that the U.S. role in world affairs is frightening for decades now. But with that kind of change, structural change in the U.S. economy, the whole relationship between the U.S. and the world would have a different calculus.
Yeah, I wish I'd showed up with a book or a constitution or program or platform. I don't have one. I'm not trying to sell you one. So all I tried to suggest was work that needs to be done, and that all of us need to do. Let me use the minute that I have to say something positive and to pose a question to my co-panelists. Right. I think you're absolutely right. We don't need a new and the reason is because we learned a lesson from the last review, which is we put out some regulations, but left both the means and incentive for those on top to undo those regulations, which of course they finally did. So, let's learn a little bit from history. But really, Ray, what you describe the world I don't recognize. And the reason I don't is when you invoke imperialist capitalism, you make it so totalizing and so complete that there's nothing left. And it seems to me that there's a problem with that, both as a conception of the world and as a way of doing politics. Joel, my good friend. Again, I think you're absolutely right. I actually think there are millions and millions of people out there, Americans, right? Let's talk about the U.S. continent, who are the potential left. I think there are all kinds of people involved in unions and social work, and education, and so on, nursing, who would love to be a part of the left, but there's no left for them to do it. That's a problem. And I think we need to think more about that. But what the hell is national capital? Does that even exist anymore? That can be somehow harnessed and fed and promoted, stimulated to provide the jobs in the United States, and I worry about that. Finally, David, as you can tell, I'm quite sympathetic to your organization and to workers actually playing a role democratically in appropriating and distributing surplus. But I think you make a mistake on the technology. And I think you're seeing it only one side of fashion. Yeah, absolutely. It's replaced workers in the automobile industry, and obviously that affects the Midwest. But you then forget about medical technologies. And I think it's incumbent upon us to, if we're going to understand what's going on in the world today, to understand its uneven development. We are in the midst of the Second Great Depression, but there are also great growth goals going on. If you go to a large number of cities in the United States, the level of economic activity is extraordinary. And I think you have to take that into account rather than seeing it as all of it. I'm done.
Okay, real quick. In a way, what I'm talking about is this next stage. Ray, when I hear you talk, I see that as maybe ultimately where the human species may want to go, but I don't see it, and I don't understand what conception of revolution. I agree we need a revolution, but I would want to argue, I do argue in my book, that the kind of transformation I'm talking about, we could imagine that taking place really if you had the political party without that much difficulty, technically. How you're going to suddenly get rid of markets and try to plan everything and so on and so forth, that I don't think is feasible. I actually do talk about it, these economic democracy evolving into something like Marx's higher stage of communism over time, but that's not the problem that we're facing. Joe, I absolutely agree with the employer of last resort kind of idea here. What I argue is to get even that much, we need a larger vision. You need a vision of where it is you want to go, and when you have that vision, it suggests a lot of reforms. So one of them is this, exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. But it also suggests nationalizing or having national banks or state banks. It also suggests having public support, for worker cooperatives and things like that. And I think it's really important that the left develop a sense that there are all kinds of different things going on, all of it part of what I like to call the counter project, okay? I also think we need an even larger vision than that. And I focus on, you gotta have institutions that you can defend to serious people and say, this would work. Okay, tell me why this wouldn't work. Got lots of data on all of this. Why wouldn't it work? Most people say, I never heard about that, never thought about that. Well, think about it, and I think you can make the case. The technology, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to see the numbers of medical technologies replacing more people than were being lost by all of the other IT stuff, and the fact that, in grocery stores now you bag your own groceries, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the secretaries are gone in our department anyway. Maybe there's enough medical technology out there. But in any event, that's capitalism has gotten a break, on technologies that didn't make things too bad. That's totally contingent. There's nothing in the nature of capital that's going to guarantee that. I think capital's run out of steam that way. There are amazing technologies, that is true, but they are not providing, there's no going back to this golden age where these new technologies, suddenly everybody was getting better and everybody had a job and, life was better for you. That's not going to happen, folks, unless there's some amazing breakthrough somehow that I can't imagine.
Sure.
I guess I just want to pose one question to the panel before I turn it over for Q&A. And that's to get, I think, something that we're already talking about in different ways, but to put it more directly, which is, what are the consequences for how we think about capitalism, given that the size of, not the numbers of people who aren't incorporated into capitalism, but the people who are unemployed in capitalism, the vastness of the reserve army of labor, we might say, and the fact that those who have relatively secure employment are either unorganized or organized in trade unions that are completely politically identified with the reproduction of capitalism, as for instance most of the trade unions in Europe. Whereas in this country we simply have a very, very weak trade unionism. So this massive transformation in the nature of labor and its political potential, how does this change the way that we think about capitalism and the way that we think about politics in the present?
Well, yeah, we can do it in reverse. How do we start down at the end of the table and just come back?
I'm with that.
Maybe this is a response to this question of the larger vision, but try and combine the two. It strikes me that the focus on the bottom end of the labor market isn't a choice among a laundry list of desirable reforms, but rather is the most fundamental, non-reversible structural change that we could even conceive of making a political reality in the U.S. So I think that addresses directly this question of the reserve army, people who are marginally connected to the economy. That seems the absolute primary issue in moving forward. By starting there, some of these other questions, which I don't deny their importance to us, questions like the imperialist position of the U.S. government or the questions of the environment, I think those are serious and critical questions. But the place to start, the place to focus, the place to give us a plan is at that bottom end of the labor market. And that's where we're going to find people to support us as we move forward. Oh, and I should just say that it strikes me that there are things that can happen in the union movement. We're in the process of getting our first contract at the faculty at UIC, and it brings up real issues for workers, even if historically the bureaucracies of various unions have left much to be desired. But clearly, eventually, this bottom third has to be joined with some kind of serious representation of the workers.
Yeah, I guess, I agree that this issue of unemployment is really big, and the people that have jobs, and never before has there been such anxiety about jobs, and how many people just have temporary jobs and so on. So, this seems to me, makes it a fertile ground for people thinking about new things. Now, I think it's more, I don't think you should just concentrate on one thing. In particular, unemployment, remember, if you know this, and my students are always surprised when I first say that, but capitalism requires unemployment. In a capitalist enterprise, you've got a fundamental contradiction. You've got the owners that want to get as much work out of their workers as possible and pay them as little as possible. And if you're working as a wage laborer, you really like to work as little as possible and get as high a wage as possible. Okay, how do you discipline the workforce? Okay, this was the problem for capitalism. Not like the good old days in slavery where you just whip people, make them work, or the good old days under feudalism when you could send the troops in and burn the village if they don't, How do you do it? You can fire them. And firing them has to have consequences. If you've got, and that's part of the reason you're going to get major resistance to this kind of full employment. Because if a worker can get fired and get another job right away, it's hard to maintain discipline that way. So I think it's really important to say this. Yes, we have responsibility for full employment, and we should be able to do those kinds of taxes. That should be out there. But there's a lot of other things going on, too, that I think we also should be talking about.
The question was posed about the changes in the composition of the labor force, so on and so forth. This is a very important question, and it gets back to what I was saying about imperialism, because there have been tremendous transformations in the social structure of accumulation and in the stratification of the U.S. working class as a result of shifts and changes in the international division of labor, so that you do have the outsourcing and the shifting of production, to parts of the third world. And you do have changes within the U.S. economy, the devastation of the inner cities of the United States. You have, certain things happening to the middle class. You have, a growing segment of the workforce in the U.S. that's informal, irregularly employed. You have, the segmentation of different strata of the working class. You have immigrants as a particular section of the proletariat who are subjected to all kinds of extra, legal coercion, so on and so forth, based on the fact that the U.S. has this privileged position in the world and uses immigrant labor to expand profits. So, how does that figure into a strategy for revolution? Well, the fact is that the social forces, the backbone for building a revolutionary movement in this society are those who suffer the greatest poverty and the brutality at the hands of this system. The people at the bottom, the people in the ghettos and the barrios, the people who are, in some cases, have one foot in employment, one foot in other kinds of, the irregular economy, the informal economy outside of gainful employment. You have these social forces who are the backbone for a movement for revolution in this society. But to build a movement for revolution and to make revolution requires that there be a broad united front involving people from the middle classes, the intellectuals, others, to be able to do what we call in our strategic orientation, achieve a two maximizing. It's maximizing the impact of resistance and upsurge from below, from those who are the most oppressed by this system, and to be able to bring into play the positive factors of other strata, the intellectuals, the artists, in the middle classes, these people, and to win them to a vision of a whole different world, of a meaningful life, of a way that humanity can live and flourish. And this is part of building a movement for revolution, making the analysis of the social forces for revolution, the fact that there is a base, a backbone for revolution in this society, but we have to have this internationalist perspective, recognize that revolution in this society is a revolution that will contribute to the emancipation of all of humanity. And we are building a movement based on this understanding of the need for and the possibility for change. And one of the things that's come up in this discussion is kind of an acceptance of the existing order. The only possibility is to kind of achieve some kind of modification, tinkering on the edges. The idea of economic democracy, to me, is all of this is saying that we will accept the existing order. Is General Motors or the pharmaceutical companies going to say, oh, well, we'll just break ourselves up, our concentrations of ownership, we'll just sort of dismiss all this and allow, these units of self-governing workers. Look at what they did to Occupy. They drove it out of the city centers. They're going to allow, these kinds of little worker collectives to function, and it's not desirable either. nowhere in this picture is there a vision of overcoming racism, of overcoming patriarchy, and to really deal with the environmental crisis requires a break with capitalism. You say that these enterprises are going to be competing with each other. Well, that is capitalism. What you have described is the dominance of the law of value. That is, production for profit, for efficiency. We can look at other examples worldwide. In Spain, for instance, where there's 50% unemployment today, there's Mondragon, a so-called worker cooperative. This is organized around capitalist principles. This was held up as a model, this cooperative in Spain. It operates according to capitalist principles of efficiency. It's outsourcing. What I am saying is that we need, yes, a total revolution. We need to confront the fact that this system that we live under rests on the savage exploitation and plunder of people and of resources. And your cell phone, not you, I'm speaking generically, your cell phone would not operate without a coltan. A mineral that's mined in the Congo. Now just take note of that. Your cell phone would not operate without a mineral mined in the Congo, right? That goes through all kinds of elaborate, complex channels of world trade and transactions. And 4 million people have died in a civil war in the Congo. But we have our cell phones. This is not tolerable. And that's why we need to make revolution. And we have an actual strategic orientation for doing it.
Spencer, can I have one word?
Yeah, please.
Since I passed through you. Ray, I got to defend where we're going. It's not a capitalist principle when an enterprise, which is governed by its workers, in the midst of an economic crisis, which, as you said, is devastating Spain and produced 25% unemployment, 50% for young people, doesn't lay off its members, but finds other places in the enterprise to locate them. That is precisely a different principle and therefore embodies. Now, there are a lot of things that one could criticize in a moment ago, but you really can't write it off as being governed by the same goddamn principles as GM or GE or some other.
Are they outsourcing to Poland?
Right, so we can have this argument. Here are the 2 points I want to make. One, a critique of the industrial reserve market, Spencer's question, is a critique of capitalism. It is part of the insanity or irrationality of the current way of organizing things. The fact that in the United States, 27.5 million people either don't have work, are underemployed involuntarily, or have given up looking for work because conditions are so bad. Focusing on seeing that, recognizing that, a lot of people don't want to recognize it, including the official statistics, means that we are calling into question the current way of organizing things. However, I'm going to caution us. It's a long history of this on the left. I think we make a mistake when we overburden our analysis of unemployment, our analyses of crises, with coming up with the left program. It's a long-standing tradition, going back to the 19th century, through the Second and Third International, down to the present, that looks as a result of the crisis, which actor in one place is going to erupt and lead us to revolution. It's a long tradition on the left, a long tradition on the Marxist left for doing that. I think it's a mistake. There needs to be political organizing. But to look for the most marginalized, whether it's in the third world or in the poorest neighborhoods of the United States or elsewhere, I think is a mistake. So my 2 points, and I'm done.
I invite you now to please line up at the microphone to ask questions. And please be patient. We're only going to deal with 3 at a time. And I know that everyone here is, as Joe says, knowledgeable people on the left who have their perspectives. And then sometimes people want to articulate those perspectives in the making of a question. I don't have a problem with that, but please keep your questions bounded in time. These are, whether we like it or not, our speakers, and you only get to ask a question. So however, whatever it be, a speech or an actual inquiry, 1 or 2 minutes, please, per question.
I don't have a cell phone deliberately, but Nevertheless, I'd like to ask what the panel's perception is of the growing transition town movement internationally that attempts to blend permaculture principles with peak energy and global climate change into a bottom-up, end around the hierarchy relocalization of the economy. When I go to organize my African American tenants at the Southside Public Housing Complex on a monthly basis, I think I can find a way to engage them with white rural farmers to do organic relocalization of their economy. I'm not too sure that it would help them to revolt against the police that are already shooting them. So I wonder whether or not you find any hope in the very positive global transition movement.
I'm Watson, a member of the Capitalism Affiliate Society. I would like to ask the panelists, I noticed that two or even maybe all four of you define capital in very national terms, in terms of either national capitals or a nationalized opposition to capital. I'd like to know how adequate that is when we live in a world in which there is a very real global capital. It's a very real fact that Toyota has factories in the South of America, that a South African mining company is about to buy up one of the biggest London-based financial firms in trading, etc. Examples are found everywhere of the essential global nature of capital. And my question is, does the response to capital or analysis of capital also need to be likewise global?
Hi. So from what I got from the speeches, each of the speakers proposed something that was like a material change. So one of them was like distribution of relative surplus value, structural changes in financial markets, vanguard leadership, changes in taxation. And I think these are all unified in that they are material changes. And I guess I want to question that, by returning to something that one of the speakers brought up, the first sentence of Capital, which has to do with how we can use the commodity form to launch, as a perspective, to launch a critique of political economy. And I think that we can read the importance of the commodity form, not only as how it dominates faculties of life in the material world, but also how it through fetishism dominates, workings in the philosophical world. And that includes ways of thinking about time and space, life, what it means to be human. And so the two questions that I have that emerge from that are one, are these material changes really to be considered effective if there is this dialogue between these workings in the material world and these workings in the philosophical world? And then also number two, I guess is the possibility of this consideration itself perhaps threatened by political and material limitations? So a recent essay that we read in Platypus was by Lukács on beautification, and that proposes this series because there are these limitations in the material world as produced by the commodity form, right? That seems to suggest to us that it's going to be very difficult to even no matter who you are, whether you're a student of neoliberal economics, whether you're a Marxist student, to pose a real interrogation of these economics. So.
That was three. Yeah. I really like to jump in those questions around
The first one I like a lot. That idea of transitions, relocalization, things like that, I think those are important things. What I want to emphasize is we need a vision, and I think that is part of the vision. It may not be the vision that everybody shares, but what I like to argue, we need a counter project. We got to realize that all kinds of people are doing different things as part of the same project, okay? And what I see myself as doing is just one piece of that project. That's saying, these are what these institutions abstractly would look like, that would work, and so on and so forth. But you can have democratic control of investment, you can have workplace democracy, but you need more than that. You need people thinking about different way of life, okay? And I think, personally, and I have a little bit about that at the end of my revised edition of After Capitalism, about, this idea of moving, to a different scale of economy, more localized, that makes sense, and so on and so forth. So I think that should be seen as part of this project, okay, an important part. As far as globalization of capital, yes, capitalism is certainly global, but here's something I think we really need to notice. Capitalism, the capitalist class, has always been able to invoke the notion of nationalism when things got tough. The Marxists were international workers of the world unite and so on and so forth, but the capitalists were always able to play that nationalization card. I think they're more vulnerable than ever before on that issue right now, because more and more the general sense is, remember back in the, what's good for General Motors is good for the country, and, that kind of thing, a sense that the capitalist class had some kind of basic loyalty to the company, to the country. That is becoming attenuated. Everybody knows those capitalists, they don't pay taxes here, they live wherever they want to live, they outsource their jobs. I think capitalism is vulnerable that way, and we need to have state power. You need to have a political party that can get some kind of state power, that can mobilize people that way. I think there's some real possibilities on that one. And I think we've talked more, but other people want a chance to.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Still late? Good. Quick comments on all three. These are wonderful questions. On the relocalization, near and dear to my heart, in part because my wife works with the Community Farm Alliance in Kentucky, which is doing exactly that. In my view, but more generally, so I really like this local food stuff. Changing with these organizations. Demands are made at local levels. Change is made because people make demands. As they make demands, they're either satisfied, in which case they go on with life, or they're not satisfied, they have to confront other things, and they make other kinds of connections. So my view is, and I will admit, I'm a bit of an anarchist in this fashion. Well, you might not have guessed it from my comments before, which you start wherever you are, including with your people. And then you start making connections. You're absolutely right. In large parts of the city, there's no way that I or anybody else are going to confront police forces. Yes, my friend will conduct a critique, but they not head on. So come on, that's crazy. More people will die. So in fact, the demand in large neighborhoods, I live in the south side of Chicago, is for more police because we want more safety. Because hundreds of people are dying a year in this city. This is a problem. Second question. On global capitalism, I absolutely agree with you, but I think we make a mistake. Capitalism didn't go global yesterday or 20 or 30 years ago. Capitalism was global from the very beginning. So the problem was always, how do we think about what's going on in other countries in relationship to our country? We need to do that analysis, and globalization today is not what it was 150 years ago. So part of our work is to understand the changing modalities of globalization. That said, the political battles that take place, while cognizant of what's going on in the rest of the world, still remain national. The states are still national. Political parties are still organized nationally, and that's where political struggle needs to take place. It's going to take place nation by nation. Right? So I think that's a reality of our age. Finally, I love the question about commodity fetishism, but I'm going to put a little twist on it. I'm a little worried about reading too much off of from the material to the ideal and back and forth. It smacks a little bit too much to me of one-to-one correspondence. Remember, commodity fetishism is a placeholder in Marx. It's where Marx said, that homo economicus, that natural propensity truck barter exchange that Smith presumed, that neoclassical economists presumed, it's not natural at all. It is, in fact, a historical and social problem. It emerged historically, and it needs to be reproduced socially in order for commodity exchange to exist. And that's only one potential subjectivity that exists. There are lots of other subjectivities that are produced during the course of economic and historical development, and precisely, I think it's incumbent upon us, once we go beyond the kind of economic analysis that we've been doing, to analyze the different ways in which different subjectivities, both individual and, importantly, collective subjectivity, are produced, including in and around commodity exchange. Let me give you a very concrete example, and that has to do with medical care. Yes, absolutely, commodity fetishism governs much of the debate about medical care in the United States, but it is also the case that as medical care has been commodified, that large numbers of people working inside hospitals who are also consumers and working on other aspects of the medical care industry have come together and demand a different kind of medical care that is not limited to the limited reforms that we've seen over the last few years. I'm done.
Let me just make one comment on the second question on global versus national, since you also questioned me on what's this national capital talk. I just say this from two sides. One, in countries where labor is far stronger than it is in the United States, capitalist countries where labor is far stronger than it is in the United States, capital in those countries has a different historically, it's had a different attitude towards labor than capital here has had, especially in the last 30 years. So I'm thinking of places, again, like Germany and Northern Europe. I'm not saying those are good capitalists, but they have been, to some extent, tamed by the realities of the political system around them and the political organization around them. On the other side, it is still the case in the world, while it's true that globalization has been here in some ways from the beginning, and while it is true that national capitals seek out profits where they can find them, it is still true that national capital is far more concentrated in home countries than it is in foreign countries. So Japanese capital is far more concentrated in Japan than it is in the United States. American capital is far more concentrated here than it is in China. Not that they aren't constantly on the lookout for profits, but that those sectors of the capitalist class worldwide have a national base. And they've been willing to use it, and that's what militarism and imperialism are all about. So in that sense, certainly there's been a move towards globalization. I'm not denying that. But capitalism still has a national base.
Just to finish this thought out, as the last one here, capital in the era of imperialism, and David is right, this is not a new phenomenon. That we're talking about a change in the functioning and the structure of capitalism, in the late 19th century, and the continuing development of that. Lenin made an analysis of imperialism, and imperialism has continued to develop and carried forth transformations in its own, ways of functioning and the reach of capitalist commodity exchange on a world scale. Capital in this era proceeds through monopoly and the particularly activating and leading role of finance capital. It proceeds through the division of the world into oppressed and oppressed nations, and it proceeds through rivalry between, great national capitals, great imperial powers. I mean, this is how the imperialist system functions, through those three great ways. Those are the ways in which capital actually accumulates on a world scale: through monopoly, through the division of the world into oppressed and oppressed nations, and through rivalry between these national capitals. So what you have in this era is a national-based capital. This is correct, but it accumulates on a world scale. It accumulates on a world scale. That is a contradiction. That it's rooted in national markets, but can only reproduce itself profitably on a global scale, and it continues to extract super profits from the third world. So this is, the ways in which capital functions. So it is correct to make this point that it is a world system that has its dynamics. And at this point in history, the U.S. imperialist formation is still dominant in the world economy. So that's one thing that I wanted to speak to. Second, in terms of this localization and relocalization, again, let's consider the fact that global climate change is being driven by this very world imperialist system. In other words, that is what's the most driving force of this. The imperialist countries are the cause of the greatest, accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. They are continuing, to emit those emissions. And if we're talking about relocalization as a way to solve the environmental crisis, when, they're drilling in the Arctic, they're drilling in West Africa. We had this Hurricane Sandy, right, which is very much linked with, all of these, all of the functioning of this world imperialist system and the role of New York as a financial nerve center of the U.S. empire. You cannot solve these problems on a local basis. The environmental problem, racism. People are talking about police, the policing of the inner cities. I mean, we're talking about 1 of 8 young black men, 1 of 8 or 9 young black men who's in prison now. Mass incarceration. This is not going to be solved by relocalization. The system is acting in a way that reflects its very functioning and its very dynamics, and it has no future for black and Latino youth. It has a future of crime, the military, or prisons. We have to look at what is actually happening to people in this society and on a world scale. The system is either going to absorb local, if you're talking about some cooperative endeavor on a local scale, this is not going to fundamentally challenge what people are living through, the machinery of world exploitation, the wars, the predator drones. These things are what's going on a world scale. The poverty, the hunger, 1 billion people without food. This is what we're confronting. But we can create a whole different world. The technological basis, the knowledge, the determination on a world scale. This exists for us to get beyond this way in which society is organized. But this is something that can only be resolved and addressed through revolution and building a movement for revolution. And we need a vision, we need an understanding of what it's going to require to do that. So this is what I want to put before people, that we are actually taking up this challenge. And the system can't be allowed to go on any longer than it has to. Because the fate of humanity is what's here. The fate of the planet. This is what's really at stake here. And a relocalized cooperative, doesn't measure up. And it's going to be absorbed. It's going to be rendered irrelevant. And it's going to lead people away from a fundamental understanding of what the problem is, which is the rule of this capitalist class and their state power, and what the solution is, which is to bring about a new economic, political, and social system. This is what's required. And these other models, and Vonnegut, I don't know, I just want to say, people in the audience, David, may not know what Vonnegut, this was a cooperative that was formed in Spain. But this is, to me, a very paradigmatic case of what this approach to local, efforts and control actually yield. Because this workers' cooperative is not fundamentally challenged the relations, the social relations, the economic relations, the dominance of a ruling class. And what's happened is that it's begun to invest, in other facilities in other parts of the world. It has to answer to competition from multinational corporations. And it is operating according to those rules of the game that I talked about. And anything that seriously challenges the system, like Occupy, is going to be confronted with the force of the state. We should learn that lesson.
We have time for one more round of questions. I'll take all the questioners who are standing.
3 quick examples to propose my question. When I was at one of the Occupy events down at downtown Chicago, in the cold winter, I was aware that we were freezing outside, and the police were all around us. And here was Roosevelt University, this wonderful bastion right across the street of academic possibilities. And they were closed out, there were a few lights on, and speaking of commodity fetishism in the traditional sense, my question has to do with the opportunity of these huge educational institutions allowing organizations with vision, that have some vision, or the opportunity for vision, to be able to utilize some of these facilities. The other example is I'm a member of Neighbors for Peace in Evanston. I happen to know Gerald Epstein at Perry and Amherst, and he came down to speak to us about finance for the people, not the bankers, right after the bubble burst. We marketed all over Northwestern for this event. At the finance department, at the econ department, 0 people came from wonderful Northwestern University to hear about finance for the people, not for the bankers. Nobody wanted to know anything about it from Northwestern. And so the question is, how, the third example is here, to compare the 3 professors with Ray. The 3 professors, here we are. I walked over here, I could see the steeple for the Rockefeller Chapel a mile away. This is a wonderful campus, a place of learning, and for all 3 of you have your place like this. Of course this is capitalism. And Ray, there's a little bookstore down in Milwaukee called Revolution Books. That's their place. How can we begin to take organizations with vision and allow these huge academic institutions to give them a little more opportunity? Is there a problem with the concept of capitalism to begin with? Is there an element of HUAC that is still present today on the campus that some of you professors are afraid to allow enough freedom of thought? To say that Ray's here to try to sell something and you don't have something to sell, it's like for a Walmart manager to have someone come in for a farmer's market and say, don't give that to my customers because I don't have anything here to give them. So how can we get these academic institutions to allow to be practically more beneficial to vision that may help?
Let me just say that there's a dangerous trend developing. There will be no questions after the gentleman behind Mel Waldenberg. So don't anyone else get up and get in the line, or else that just sort of has an endless kind of scary so just you guys, no one else.
My question is directed at the panelists who argue that new technology has been destroying more jobs than creating jobs. I'm just going to state a fact or something I learned from reading my economics textbook. The process of technology destroying jobs, we could say that that's more, I could argue that that's just more efficient allocation of resources because that new technology allows us to produce more. And through the workers that do get fired from their jobs, they're free to go into other more productive areas of labor. Except that I do recognize that due to the lack of education or like resources like that, that prevents them from going to these more productive jobs. But we could argue that as long as capitalism promotes more education or makes education more accessible, that problem that you mentioned with new technology destroying jobs won't be an issue anymore. Thank you.
I just had taking a step back a little bit. I was just interested in how, I got a sense from all of the panelists when they were speaking that, there was a sense in which the actual, the kind of depth of this crisis and what it means just for people, like immediately in their lives, sort of like objectively. The depth of that isn't really being registered at the level of any kind of like revitalized movement. I mean, you had things sort of like Occupy, but there's a way in which it doesn't quite seem to be enough or as much as one would expect. So I guess my question is, I'd be interested in hearing the panel specify why they think that, if that is the case, and if so, why? In other words, what bars the sort of primary obstacles to the left today that's preventing, broadly speaking, any types of social movements from really, widely politicizing, loss of jobs, underemployment, stagnation, etc.
Hi, I found the discussion very interesting, and I want to apologize. I came in late because I just got off the plane from New York, so I wasn't because I took this meeting differently. I wish I would have arrived back earlier and heard the whole thing. So maybe the point, or the question I have is really answered in the early part of the discussion, and therefore it's irrelevant. But I doesn't sound like it. And I guess mainly the comment I made is to Lotta and then to support a little bit what Persky said. The radical intellectuals, like the people here, many of them, the people on the panel, are of course necessary for making revolution, but they're not sufficient, and in fact they're not the main force. People make revolution of social classes, and when you're talking about making revolution, you've got to talk about social class and the level of political preparation and awareness social classes have. Now, in the advanced, it's a sad fact, but in the advanced industrial countries of the United States, no major section of the working class is committed to socialist revolution. I don't, in any serious way, there's no leadership that has capacity to mobilize workers around this kind of a program at this point in time. So that I think when in this situation talking about revolution is somewhat frivolous, that's where I think that Joe Persky's comments come into play, that the lower levels of the working class of color, many of the majority of working class of color, are shut out of the labor market, the regular labor market, more and more. And therefore, this is, from the point of view of Marxists, this should be an opportunity, therefore, to have a program and to try and find a political mechanism for mobilizing those sections of the working class who really have less to lose than teachers who are now more militant than the people who don't have jobs, but who have a lot more to lose in the system. And so I think that one has to take the issue of joblessness and the layers of the working class that don't have a regular attachment to the labor market very seriously from a political point of view. And I haven't heard that except from Joe.
All right, I am going to try and keep this conversation relatively short. First, I will start off by going and adding on to the guy who was the person for me, and he went and talked about the factor of joblessness. And I'd like to go and ask you a question. What would your opinion be of those who choose not to fight the system itself, but choose to try to find a way to basically tune in and drop out of the system, basically saying that the entire system is garbage and that you should go and go your own way? There are social movements which I've mainly seen on the internet. There's one called Men Going Their Own Way, which I can understand you would say MGTOW is a bit of a backwards reactionary group, but Men Going Their Own Way says you should not get married, you should go and focus on developing yourself. There is another group of people, and they call themselves the Hikikomori, and they're basically people who are the shut-in of society. They basically decide that the present-day society is basically crap for them, and they say you should go and withdraw. Some people, some related people to Hikikomori will basically go voluntarily homeless for a period of time, and some basically go and stay in their room or apartment for days, months, years at a time, trying to make a living off of the online, off of the web. But I have another question. It is addressed to the person who said that the hard left concept of going and appealing to the most oppressed people is a bad idea. My main question is, why would you say that is a bad idea, and why would you say that theory is a failure? I can understand it if you would say, for example, by appealing to the U.S., that's saying appealing to certain ethnic groups explicitly might be a bad idea unless it turned into a explicitly nationalistic backlash, like for example, in the hypothetical post-revolutionary North America, where the black nationalists managed to establish an explicitly black republic, and they decided to expel the European population within those borders. I can understand if you're saying that risking an explicitly nationalist response like that might be a bad idea. But is there any other reasons why you would say that appealing to the most disadvantaged and oppressed populations wherever or all around the world for a revolution is a bad idea? And the last thing is, I probably missed it, would you say that peak oil or peak energy, as the first panelist here talked about, would go and provoke a collapse of the capitalist system by itself, given that the entire system of worldwide capital requires cheap energy to go and ship something from across an ocean, and when that energy, and when there is an energy crunch, that will go and result in the entire capitalist system collapsing and forcing a relocalization, even if a few million people might die, assuming the worst case scenario people what happens. That's all.
You guys are going to have to fold your answers to that and Patrick's questions as your final remarks. And so you take about 3 to 5 minutes. And I don't know if you want to jump in or if you want to suggest an order. Maybe, unless you don't. Why don't we start with you, Ray?
Take 5 minutes.
The world we live in is intolerable. It's unacceptable. And we have to recognize what is at the bottom of the suffering and the horror of this world. And it is the operation and the functioning of this system. And we have to understand, and this is what I want to remind people of, that there was a breakthrough for humanity in the 20th century. The two revolutions, the two great socialist revolutions that took place in the Soviet Union and in China, from 1917 to 1956 in the Soviet Union, and in China from 1949 to 1976. These revolutions actually brought forward something new, something liberatory, something vibrant, something exciting, and something that actually pointed to the possibility of a very different world, because that was the future that was being forged in those societies. But they were defeated by the greater power and force of imperialism, by the fact that these societies themselves were transitional societies and contained the inequalities, continued persistence of money and commodity relations, things that can't be eliminated overnight, and new bourgeois and privileged forces arose to defeat those revolutions, and they were under incredible and unrelenting pressure and assault from the world imperialist system. But there was this breakthrough, and this is something that's been blotted out. You know, we have these discussions about alternatives, about how the world can be. This experience is precious, it is momentous, it's the most transformative thing that has happened since the emergence of class society. That is, to create a society and a world in which exploitation no longer exists, and in which people are beginning increasingly to take responsibility for the direction of society, in which people are moving towards consciously and voluntarily changing themselves and changing the world. Now, those revolutions are defeated, and what I got into in my remarks was that Bob Avakian, chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, has summed up this experience, what its great breakthroughs were, but its problems and shortcomings as well, and has brought forward a new framework to initiate a new stage of communist revolution. That is what's on the table in my presentation here. And this is not just an idea or a wish or a hope. This is actually what is materially possible in the world that we live in. It is materially possible to move beyond exploitation and scarcity. It is possible to confront this environmental crisis. It is possible to really tackle racism and the degradation of women, The objectification, yes, commodification of everything, from people to ideas, intellectual property rights. This is not the way things have to be. There's no permanent necessity to the way the world is. And people have to recognize that the system is inculcating people with the idea that there's no way out, there's no other alternative to this. And this weighs very heavily on people. But there is something that represents a viable and visionary alternative, and that is this new synthesis of communism that is, as I said, concentrated in this Constitution. How would you actually run a new economy? How would you do it? How would you reconfigure, as I said, a formerly imperialist economy? How do you do that? These issues are addressed in here. There is experience from history that has been learned from, the problems and the mistakes that were made in these revolutions, but there's a whole new leap in understanding. And this, as I said, is what this new synthesis of communism from Avakian represents. This is a new leap in the development of the science of Marxism. And it's a transformative. I do agree that Marx's point about the philosophers of only, that it's not enough to interpret the world, the point is to change the world. But what's really at stake here, and what's really in play in debate at this table, is what kind of change are we talking about? That's the fundamental point of dispute here. Are we really talking about something that's transformative? Something that moves humanity beyond these commodity relations? That moves us to a position, and that's what the significance of proletarian revolution, of the proletariat is. The significance of the proletariat as a class is not that it's exploited or that people will fight back. The significance of the proletariat is that it is the force that can actually instantiate new relations of production, that can move humanity to a whole new stage of development. That requires leadership. It requires visionary, dedicated leadership based on the most advanced scientific understanding of the way the world is and the way it can be. And that's what this new synthesis represents. But what kind of change are we talking about here? Are we talking about local enclaves? People dropping out? Well, you can't drop out. They've got the surveillance. They've got you numbered. They've got you surveilled. Are we talking about small little enclaves, niches? That's not going to address these problems. Occupy was a great thing, and is a great thing, because it was involving people standing up and actually trying to model some new ways of interacting with each other, new values. But this is this was a movement that can be part of a revolutionary, building a movement for revolution, become part of a movement for revolution. That requires that communists give leadership in an all-round sense to the needs and requirements of mounting the kind of struggle that's required in this society. We have a strategy, as I said, and it involves doing political and ideological and organizational work today. It involves a principle that's called fight the power, transform the people for revolution, where people are resisting fault line questions, where people are standing up and they're fighting the power, and people are transforming their thinking and their values. And part of that transformation involves grappling with the possibility of a whole different world, communism, and what it's going to take to get there. Transform the people for revolution. Prepare the ground for revolution. Hastening, doing political work that can hasten the day where we can actually go up against this system when it brings down its force, when people in their millions, tens of millions, when people in the millions are saying no more. But this requires leadership, it requires direction. When there's a severe, much more severe crisis within the system, legitimacy is questioned, where people say no more, and people are determined to do something, to bring a new world into being. We are preparing the ground for that, and we are bringing forward this vision. And as I said, we have a concrete alternative to the way this world, this
system operates. We have a concrete alternative. And that is what we are building this movement for revolution around. But I think people have to understand, what is the problem that we're facing, and what kind of change is really needed, and what kind of change is actually possible? And that's what I'm here to argue.
Okay. I disagree. No, I mean, you're wrong about what the fundamental difference is. We all agree that the present world is awful. We all agree that another kind of better world is possible. That's not what the debate is about. The debate is, how would you get there? Okay? What actual institutions would you have? How do you convince people that say, oh, this is just pie in the sky? Yeah, revolution. Yeah, how are you going to do it? Storm the White House? What are you going to do, guys? You know, how are you going to get everybody, you know, to do all that kind of stuff? I mean, those things have to be addressed, you know. It's not enough just to say moral. And when you say, oh, you people are doing that thing, well, you're just wasting your time. Whereas what we're doing, we're not wasting our time because we got a theory that says this is where it is and so on. No, I think you're going to have a large political movement. It is going to have to involve individuals changing their lives. It's going to involve individuals involved in small-scale projects of lots of different kinds. You could be working on prison reform. I've got no problem. Quite the contrary. Absolutely, the prison stuff is a scandal in this country. So are lots of other things scandalous. Unemployment is scandalous. Students coming out of college overburdened with debt and can't find jobs. That's a problem. And by the way, education is not the answer. Education just means the qualifications for getting the jobs that are there go up. I mean, and there's lots of evidence about that. So this idea that jobs will just magically materialize if you have an education, you shouldn't believe that. I think most students know better than that now, although that was originally, you know, the promise there. But I think you need a strategy. You need to be able to answer honest questions like, give me a realistic scenario as to how this alternative economy would work. You know, it's not so different. You know, yeah, we have a democratic enterprise. Yeah, we've Mondragon. We studied those. We know that kind of thing can be done. Don't say you're wasting your time with Mondragon because it's not changing the world. Nothing any of us are doing are changing the world at this point. But what we need to do is have a sense that you can work locally, you can do certain kinds of things, you can create a new vision of a world where it's more locally based and you have more contact with nature and things like that. But you're also part of a larger project that knows you've got to get political power, so you've got to know what's the answer for how are you going to get political power. You know, political movement can develop. We've seen surprises recently in the last decade. Who would have thought Cesar Chavez or Lula could have come democratically to power? No, yes, they're not perfect. Yes, we know all of that. But they did things that nobody thought was possible before. You know, nobody thought the Soviet Union was going to collapse before, then suddenly it did. So things can change in unexpected ways, and it will involve lots of people. And my sense is there's lots of stuff going on beneath the radar right now. I mean, there's lots of people involved in all kinds of things. What's not yet come forward is that sense that somehow we're all in it together. And it doesn't help to say, well, what you're doing, you think that having that garden is going to change the world, eliminate global poverty. No, you don't think that. Nobody thinks that. But you feel like you're doing something to this larger project. Nothing any one of us is doing any of these other things. But I think the capital system is suffering a legitimation crisis. No, it's not the final crisis. We can't guarantee that it's going to be swept away. No, the more likely scenario in the short run is, no, the capitalists will just, you know, larger, more employment. Get used to it. The new normal. More and more people unemployed. Yeah. Have more gated communities. You know, if things are going bad in your country, tide's getting too high, we'll fly to another country, and so on and so forth. You know, we don't have. That's part of the problem. That capitalist class, they don't have any stake in this anymore. Okay, which I think opens up certain kinds of possibilities for a political movement. We're not going to know it if we don't try it. We've got to be as broad and inclusive, I think, as we can be.
I just want to make 2 points in response to the questions or statements. One is a small, hopefully constructive point. One maybe is a larger one. The smaller point addresses the question of the educational facilities at Roosevelt University, or there was also some discussion of education as a means out of the long-term crisis in the economy. I think the way we start addressing those institutions, whether it be Roosevelt or it be my school or it be this school right here that has lots of labor problems of its own, the way we start addressing it is by organizing the people who work here at every level of the university, and in a fashion then to try and influence what the purposes of the university really are, including the question of opening universities to people who need them. And I see that as ultimately coming out of a labor struggle at the universities around the country, a labor struggle at lots of different levels. So that's a small point, but hopefully constructive. The bigger point is this question of when we talk about creating jobs, we're not just talking about generating income. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that jobs are for production. Right now, people who need things, need services, do not have the ability to purchase them given the way income is distributed in the country, given the way finance has pushed wages down and has created the crisis that we see around us. Under those circumstances, and this is a little bit on the question of dropping out or whatever that alternative is, dropping out denies the very need we have for people's labor. We all need it. We need it together as a community. And as such, the purpose of a job program is, on one hand, to create income, but on the other hand, to make sure that people are contributing to that larger society. So I'll just leave it there.
Why don't you drop out? I drop out. I can't go. It doesn't work for me. So I fully, if anybody wants to drop out, fine. I have lots of friends of mine. Very probably some of them died along the way from drugs in other countries. But we don't, a lot of other people don't. And so I'm not going to stand up, I'm not going to read the right act to anybody who chooses to do that. You know, a lot of things suck out there. So that makes perfect sense. But it's not a way of doing politics. That's what it is. So let me go quickly through at least some of the questions. On the universities and Occupy Wall Street, we were wrong. Most of us, I don't know about my fellow members, most of us expected Occupy to come into the universities in the spring. Once they were occupied from some public spaces or in the case of Chicago cycle. It didn't happen. But we have to recognize that many of the participants in Occupy Wall Street were and remain college and university students. So it's not like it didn't have an effect at all. And I don't think. All right, you can't hear me, huh? But I don't think it's because professors in the universities wouldn't have been happy with it. In fact, in my view, and I teach at a very conservative private university, I think they actually would have quite welcomed the kinds of discussions and demands in Occupy Wall Street, and I think that's true of many universities. For the most part, especially in the social sciences and humanities, we are at least liberals, except in economics. I mean, speaking of economics, you learn your Econ 101 very well. That's exactly the argument that is made. That new technologies produce efficient allocation of resources, and if somebody gets laid off from their job, they'll find, they are free to find another job. And it's exactly, when I teach this stuff, that's what I teach, and your professor taught me the same thing. But there's a problem, a theoretical problem and a problem of the real world, which most the theoretical problem is that it presumes that you start from an efficient allocation of resources, such that when there's a change, you get a new efficient allocation of resources. I think one would be hard-pressed, including people who teach that nonsense, to say that the world even approaches an efficient allocation of resources. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, in reality, when people get laid off from jobs, for whatever reason, including technology, firm going under, and so on, that if and when they find a new job, they often make 40% less than on the old job. And that is if they find a good job. So there's a real world problem with just assuming that markets will clear and all the faculty will be allocated efficiently. And so next time you talk to an economics professor, you can raise those points and you'll be really smart when you do so. even if they're disgusted by the prospect that they actually have to entertain assessments. So why weren't there more Occupy Wall Streets or movements like Occupy Wall Street? And I gotta blame us. I think it's a failure of the left. It's our fault. It's not because of police repression. It's not because the state came down hard on us and so on and so forth. We didn't do the acting. It was the beginning of something. Maybe there will be something else. I have no idea. History is unpredictable in that way. But I want to charge us on the left with a fundamental problem. We don't like to do politics. We like to get good demonstrations and we like to do this thing. We don't have to do, what I mean by politics is what political activists do, and they spend 10, 15, 20 years. Ray does it. There aren't many more who like to do it. My own preferred solution is not to work in Ray's organization, but to work elsewhere. And now Ray's going to get really upset at me. Because my view is somebody who wants to do real political change in the United States works for 5, 10, 15, 20 years patiently, hard inside the Democratic Party. If you want to do mass-based politics in the United States, I know. As soon as I open my mouth and do that, everybody gets upset, and I'm sorry, and we can have that argument, but somebody's got to say it. And so
Let's ask Ralph Nader about that strategy. It doesn't work. Ask Ron Paul, too, on the opposite end.
So everybody be pure, and a good organization, and everything will be fine. That's a problem. Lastly, and I do think we agree with this, we as a society made a pact with the devil. And the pact with the devil was that if capitalists appropriated the surplus, that they would use it and accumulate and create decent jobs and decent government programs in the rest of society. They failed. We don't have to sign that pact anymore. They can't. They're unwilling to provide decent jobs. They're unwilling to be taxed to provide decent social programs. They broke their side of the deal, which means we don't have to keep them outside of the deal. So whether it be Ray's organization or some other organization, that's, I think, the basis on which we move forward. Thank
you. You guys didn't need an invitation to thank our panelists, clearly. I just wanted to say that on behalf of Platypus, to thank all of our panelists and to say that Ray's organization is here with the table. We have some time left in this room. Also, Platypus has the Platypus Review here that's available for free. So we do have a few minutes as you go home. If you want to stop by those before you clear out, I think we have to clear out by 8. Is that right, Tom? Yeah, people should start going home. But they did take the time to set up the table, and we took the time to set up ours.